As Nicola mentioned, I'm part of a project called Oceanic Exchanges, and the aim of Oceanic Exchanges is to use all this lovely digitized newspaper data that we find popping up all around the world in order to understand something very particular about the 19th century press and 19th century periodicals more specifically, and that is scissors and paste journalism. Now, scissors and paste journalism is something that is very easy and very difficult to understand at the same time. On the one hand, it's very simple. It's copying. It's taking news or editorials or human interest stories or poetry or letters to the editor or anything that appears in a periodical and reprinting it or republishing it in a different periodical. The reason why it's complicated is there aren't a lot of rules surrounding who did this, why they did it, how they did it, whether or not they were allowed to do it. In some cases, especially in the United States in the early 19th century, but in the Anglophone world more widely, it was considered a public good. It was good to copy because people couldn't afford to have newspapers from all around the world. They couldn't afford to have journalists and roving reporters all around the world. So if you got a newspaper from somewhere else, took out the best bits, and put them in your newspaper, you were doing your job as an editor or a printer or a journalist. That was part of your role as a newspaper man or woman. As we move along throughout the 19th century, people start to get a little bit more prickly about the idea of scissors and paste journalism. People begin to have bylines attached to their articles. People begin to worry about copyright attached to their articles. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this came about. The first was because newspapers became a bit more institutionalized, a bit more grandee of society, and they wanted to protect their brand and their commercial interest in the community. They were no longer just sending their newspapers out to the local town or region. They could be national newspapers, even international newspapers, in the case of some of the major metropolitan ones in Europe and the United States. So they wanted to protect their content. The other thing that really made this very, very expensive was the telegraph. If you're going to spend hundreds of pounds or dollars to get stories first, you don't want other people taking them from you. So across the 19th century, scissors and paste goes from a public good that governments actually support by giving free or heavily subsidized postage to newspapers to something that is considered plagiarism and theft and copyright infringement. So this is a very interesting thing to study over the course of the 19th century. And one of the things that's made it really, really much more straightforward to understand is digitization. Understanding 19th century newspapers through digitization is important because although we knew scissors and paste existed for a very long time, we could see it through attributions or through the fact that we just noticed we saw a particular article more than once. We didn't have a way of really understanding the scale of it. We could say it happened a lot. I see it all the time. But that's not very quantifiable. That's not a very scholarly way of talking about scissors and paste. Digitization gives us an entirely different way of looking at it. So when I looked around at various newspaper repositories, various institutions that held newspapers, and the conversations they were having internally about why to digitize, these are the sorts of things that came out across many of them, although the Michigan State Library did encapsulate it quite well. The first was to increase the breadth of access, to make more things available to more people. And that's a pretty laudable goal, I think we can all agree. To make available multiple local users at once. So you don't have one person hoarding all the volumes of the Times or the Kelso Mail, as I did for most of my PhD. No one else in Scotland could look at those while I was. You could also make it available to anyone with internet access. And what's interesting about Michigan is they actually say, if you choose. So it wasn't necessarily a given that you'd want to make it available on the internet. Decrease the need to use fragile originals, preserve the copies that you have, and finally, sort of as an afterthought, to make the text searchable. Now this last one is probably the most important because what does it actually mean to make the text searchable. In the early days of digitization, what it generally meant was a Google type interface where you'd have a single Boolean search box, and you would type in the words that interested you, and you would hope for the best. And they might come up in date order, they might come up in relevance order, which is always a little bit suspicious to a researcher because first, you don't know what their relevance rating is. Sometimes they tell you, but not usually. And two, relevance rankings tend to change over time. So if I search for something today and I search for something a year from now, I might get entirely different results, or at least the first couple pages might be entirely different results. And the most difficult thing about making the text searchable is unless you are going to hire an army of keyers, which is unlikely in the current budget framework of most countries, you're going to rely on optical character recognition. You're going to rely on computerized scanning of images to make text readable by a computer. And this is great. It works pretty well, I would say 75%, 60% well, but there are a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of difficulties you have when you try to take an 18th or an early 19th century Anglophone text and make it OCR searchable. You get lots of errors. The becomes all sorts of L, N, M, E, squiggly line kind of characters. And it's even worse with German Gothic script. I feel very, very bad for German OCR scholars. But I think what the state of Michigan probably fails to include here, and I think a lot of databases didn't really understand at the beginning, is just how powerful having access to that raw transcript database is. Being able to use full searching across huge corpora at once with very specific and complicated questions. So what I was able to do with the kind help of the British Library is I was able to take the 19th century newspapers collection that they had digitized, and I was able to do a distant reading of it. Now, this is not meant to be very readable. I understand it's a bunch of colorful lines, but I'll try to explain it to you in a little bit more detail. So what I did is I took these 2 million pages of OCR text, they were just plain text format, and I put it through something called CopyFind, which is an open source plagiarism detection software developed by a physics professor in Virginia because he didn't like Turnitin. He wanted to have his own plagiarism detection software to catch out naughty students in his class. But he made it available online, and what was great about this software is it was OCR agnostic, we'll say. It could be very, very fuzzy in how it matched text together. So there could be quite a lot of OCR errors, and it would still do a really good job finding blocks of text. So I went through the entire collection, ran it against itself, and I put in an arbitrary time frame of about 14 days between copies. Going through the text manually, a news cycle was about 2 weeks. If it was more than 2 weeks old, it was usually a false positive, a similar story, but not the same bit of text being repeated. And what we find across this period from the 1820s to the 1860s is that the size of reprinted text, the chunk of text that appeared in multiple pieces in the corpus, was fairly consistent. So these two big bars in the middle represent 300 words and 400 words. That's how big of a match it would find at any one place. Now, as I'll talk about in a little bit, this does not mean that it was 300 word articles and 400 word articles. Often it was several smaller articles stapled together to create these. But what this really shows us is that there was a general acceptability across the 19th century that if you took 200 to 400 words of text from somebody else, that was fine. That was accepted, that was general practice across the news media in the British world. And what is particularly interesting about this, although this graph doesn't demonstrate it, is the fact that this was not a case of the provinces stealing from London. This was a multipolar system. You would have places in Scotland, places in Birmingham, in Wales, in London, in Cheshire, sending news out, it being copied around, and it receiving news from London and all the other places in Britain as well. And this gave us proof of scissors and paste. Something we knew existed, something we had known about for a long time, but it gave us hard statistical evidence that this was a large-scale process. Now, my project is not the only one that's been doing this. There are several other groups, notably Ryan Cordell, who will be speaking later this month in his viral text project. But we've all taken slightly different approaches, and we've all come to very similar conclusions. And the most important thing to remember is that this is just simply not possible manually. It's only possible when we have access to that OCR text that we want to deal with. Now, this was all well and good. I got quite a lot of evidence out of it. I was able to talk about the evolution of certain stories, how they traveled across the country, who were the gatekeepers of news, who were the ones who sent out the most news but didn't take other people's news in very much. But I began to get a bit text-wary. Now that might seem a little bit strange dealing with 18th and early 19th century newspapers. They are big walls of text. They have images, usually of runaway slaves or of little ships. The ship icon was the way to go if you were going to be an engraver in the early 19th century. Never-ending need for little ship icons. But I wanted to do something different. I wanted to see if I could understand the text in a different way. And that really brought me to the idea of contextualizing my distant reading through a close reading of these newspapers. So these three images, and I'll get rid of the legends for a minute so you can see them more clearly. These three images are all the same paper. They're all the same page of the Caledonian Mercury from the 15th of June, 1840. It's page 3, and the reason I chose page 3 is because it's the most interesting page. It usually has the most varied content in British early 19th century newspapers. And what I was able to do is, by looking at that distant reading, I was able to see that the Caledonian Mercury, even though it's sort of a thrice-weekly provincial Edinburgh newspaper, was really representative of the corpus as a whole. It kind of was the median. It had the right average word counts, the right average frequency of copying, the right average types of copying. So I decided to use it as a case study. And I created a very simple table that listed every single article that I found in this page and some characteristics about it. Now, as you can see, there's not a whole lot of distinguishing features between the different articles. And what the computer zones as different articles for an online database does not really match with the experience of reading through it. So there's no hard and fast rules. I just kind of had to read through it and say, yeah, that sounds like a different person talking, or yeah, it's a different topic, or oh, they've moved on to a different day, and zone it myself manually. So I went through it, gave every single snippet, as I called it, its own word count and descriptor. And what I was able to find were these two main trends. So if you look on the right-hand side, these are all the snippets marked out, and they are shaded or colored by where the source of the material came from. And these are marked by attributions that were actually given. This isn't using the distant reading at all at this point. This is just where they said they got it from. So the lightest color ones are local. They were said they came from Edinburgh or Leith or from Perth. The slightly darker ones are regional, so they're Scottish news. And the even darker ones are national, and the darkest are international. So this gives you a sense of sort of the range of material you would find on the page. You'd find the whole world. Now this is source location. It's not actually the action of the articles. Sometimes an article would be sourced from London, but it was about Paris, or it would be sourced from Paris, but it was about Istanbul, or it would be sourced from London and it was about New Zealand, and you have to sort of take that into account. But they actually had a wide range of sources bringing them information in. If you look at the other one, this is source type. So what kind of paper are they attributing? So again, the very light colored ones are just location. we got this from Edinburgh, we got this from Birmingham. We hear from the Americas that. But as you get darker, you get much more specific information. So the light tone, and these are all available online if you want to look at them a bit more detailed. The lighter tone are from ambiguous publications like a Scottish paper says, or a London paper from the evening. The sort of mid-dark is a specific title, so from the Times, from the Gazette, and the darkest ones are ones that were unknowable. They gave no attribution whatsoever. But what you can kind of see is that they're pretty good about attributing. They're not stealing without saying where they're getting it from. They might not always be saying honestly where they're getting it from. There was a tendency to do what my students do, which is footnote swipe. So if there was an article from the Sydney Gazette that appeared in the Times, they would say it was from the Sydney Gazette. The fact that the Times published it was really irrelevant. And that's kind of fair enough. Because if you look at this, a person reading the newspaper doesn't know many journalists' names, may not know very many different newspapers, but they can kind of get a nice sense of the geography of the world. So if there's an article about Tasmania from the Sydney Gazette, that's going to be a lot more reliable to them than if they're honest and say they got it from the Times, because what does London know about what life in Tasmania is like? So this sense of source attribution is really important to conveying authority and authenticity to the people who are reading these newspapers. So after going through about 6 or 7 issues of the Caledonian Mercury, chopping it all up into these tables and running it through a visualization program to create these, it became really clear to me that this is something that needs automation. So there are lots of articles that do similar anatomies of newspapers, where they've taken out rulers and taken out copies and facsimiles and measured how many column inches is devoted to news or commentary or editorials. And then they make assumptions based on that sample, what the average newspaper is comprised of. But if you can use OCR text to create word counts, and these are all based on word count percentages as opposed to actual column inches, so how long the poor compositor was standing there putting in various bits of type. And you can automate it across lots and lots of different newspaper pages and create lots of images very quickly. You can see change within a single issue, change between different publications at the same time, and change across a very long period of time to look for trends. And it reduces a lot of the manual labor that meant that a very excellent book on Australian newspapers that was published in the 60s had 12 random samples from across a century. That's not enough samples. Digitization really allows us to visualize text in new and really helpful ways. So I've got a big hard drive full of these images. What sort of things can I do with them now? Well, I can go back to my big data. So by looking at these individual newspapers, I was able to say that 80% of a given newspaper, of the non-advertising material, take the advertisings out because it's a whole different ballgame, about 80% was attributed. And I could say how much of that was numerical content, how much of that was news, how much of that was commentary, and they all had slightly different percentages. Numerical content was pretty unlikely to be cited. I guess it was considered public domain information. Commentaries were slightly more likely to be cited than just normal news, maybe because they felt that an author had moral rights to a bit of fiction or to something that was more analytical content than just straight news. So once I had a sense of how many newspapers were attributed, what types of text they were, I compared them against my big data corpus again, and I found out how much was I able to find computationally versus how much could I find manually. And there was some overlap. Not a huge amount of overlap, but a little bit of overlap. And from this, I was able to extrapolate that if my computational match finds this much word count that's matching, this is how much actual duplicate content probably exists in these different newspapers. And I tested it at about 5 different years, doing manual checks, and then I ran it across the entire corpus from 1825 to 1835. And you can see there is quite a lot of variation between these different years. And there's actually a noticeable dip in 1827. Now, what's fascinating about this is that if you go back into the Edinburgh magazines and you look at sort of the commentary of the day, 1827 is when a man named Dr. Brown became editor of the Caledonian Mercury, and people praised him for his ability to get exclusive and late-breaking news compared to his predecessors. So you can see there's a dip in duplicated content exactly where there is a rise in commentary that he's doing a good job getting new news, not using duplicate news in his newspapers. So that sort of gave me a feeling that I was on the right track with these extrapolations. Now, this gives us a sense of how much content is being copied. It gives us a sense of how much is being used. And this is slightly incorrect because it was based on summer issues. Now, summer issues are probably going to have a very different spread of news than winter issues because of when Parliament is in session, when ships are coming back from various parts of the colonies. But that's why I call this iterative research or medium-scale analysis. You go back and forth. Now that this seems to have a general sense of working, I would go back and do more close readings of different times of the year, different special events happening, and then go back to my big data, back and forth, and be able to create these visualizations that actually give you a really good sense of what is going on in these articles. That brings me to New Zealand. Now, I've been doing a lot of work with British newspapers. I got a really good sense of how a British newspaper was constructed, when things were sort of slightly odd or slightly typical in a newspaper. So I could see the Caledonian Mercury was sort of the average newspaper, whereas something like the Examiner was really weird because it had tiny pages and it liked to rant for many of those pages instead of actually producing news. Would all of this hard-earned knowledge actually translate to the press outside of Britain, to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada? Well, here is the New Zealand Gazette and Wellington Spectator of September 7th, 1842. And this is as it appears on Papers Past. Now, if you hover over it in Papers Past, you find there are 35 clickable paragraphs, but they're not actually 35 articles according to Papers Past. According to Papers Past, there are 4 articles, and it actually smushes quite a lot of them together. So I went through it manually, the same way I had with the Caledonian Mercury, and I found what I think are 32 separate snippets. 32 things that clearly were different topics or had come from slightly different sources or were written at different times. And you can tell that by the grammar, the slight change of perspective that happens in these snippets. So I took this, and again, this is page 3 because I was sort of the impression that maybe page 3 would continue to be interesting in colonial presses. And when I visualized it, I found some really interesting points. Now, this is coded for source type. And New Zealand Gazette was very, very good about attributing, much better about attributing than most of the British presses that I had actually looked at. They would not get caught for plagiarism in school. And if you look at it, the first column and a bit, the first one is just the legend, but the first column and a bit is local only, and that was sort of Wellington gossip. Things that would probably have been given directly to the editor or had come from the quayside or something to that effect. The next section, you see lots and lots of named publications, namely The Colonist, the Nelson Gazette, and several British publications. And the sort of light-toned ones in the middle there are ambiguous publications where they just said the English papers. So they're giving a sense of where they came from, but maybe they didn't feel that their readers would know all of the individual English newspapers they were citing from. So this is really interesting because it is mostly scissors and paste journalism. There's a little bit of local gossip, but everything else tends to come from other places. Now, to be fair, quite a lot of this particular issue was the editor of the Gazette complaining that he was being misrepresented in the Colonist and the Nelson Gazette, and there was a lot of banter going back and forth between these 3 newspapers. But if you look at it as coded for source location, it's very, very neatly organized, very much less of a hodgepodge than most of my British newspapers. You have the solid local section, followed by the New Zealand section, which is mostly Auckland and Nelson. And then it was followed by an English section, and what I found fascinating was a Scottish section. It made a very clear distinction, and the two did not mix whatsoever in their publication. Now, it was mostly from the New Zealand Journal, which was a London publication, and the Times and the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald. So they are getting a variety of sources, but they are very much segmenting it into clear and definable sections. And this might indicate that they want to give a fair and balanced view, New Zealand and the home country, or it might just be that they're putting things into their newspaper as they're reading it, and they're not thinking thematically how to reorganize it once they put it onto their page. But basically what I found particularly interesting was the fact that it was so clearly attributed by both location and by title. Now, a lot of the Australasian editors were not Australasian editors by birth, especially in the first years. Obviously, you're not going to have kindergartners running the newspapers. Instead, they mostly came from other colonies. The Sydney Gazette was run by someone from the West Indies, and of course the New Zealand Gazette, somebody who had worked in both Canada and the UK. So these are, in my opinion, a distillation, a refinement of practices that had already been kind of organically developing in Britain and had become much more professionalized and, we'll say, slightly rigid in the colonial newspapers. And that's something I'm hoping to see in other locations or have completely blown out of the water. Either is perfectly fine, but it's a hypothesis I'm working on. So in conclusion, what I would really like to sort of impress upon you is the fact that newspaper digitization has been primarily separated into two aspects. One is the facsimile images, being able to browse through old newspapers and see them as a facsimile of a newspaper you maybe can't get a physical copy of. The other half has been the searchable text, being able to dive in right for that keyword that you're looking for, or to do some text mining to say, this word suddenly becomes much more important in the 1840s than it had ever been before, as people are very fond of doing with Google Ngram Viewer. But there really is much more of an overlap, so I would encourage people working with newspapers, people working with digitized newspapers, to try to textualize and contextualize the images they look at and visualize and reimagine the text they're looking at. And it will help both sides really get something much more out of digitized newspaper than either could do on their own. Thank you very much.